Modern war has almost nothing in common with the image of war most people carry in their heads. This video is about how war actually works today, not how we imagine it. Like, subscribe, and let's begin. The way most people imagine war is not based on experience. It is inherited. Cinema, archival footage, history books, documentaries, all of them have repeated the same visual language for decades. Tanks moving across maps. Clear front lines. Battles that begin, escalate, and end. Heroes, offensives, turning points. This image feels natural not because it is accurate, but because it has been reinforced for generations. What rarely gets acknowledged is that this image describes a very specific technological phase of war. Industrial war. A form of conflict where mass production, physical presence, and linear movement were decisive. Where the battlefield was a place you could point to, and war itself was something that visibly happened. That framework still dominates public perception, even though the conditions that created it no longer do. At a systemic level, modern war has detached itself from that visual logic. It no longer needs to present itself as a sequence of visible events to function. Large parts of it unfold outside the frame, not as battles, but as processes. And yet, the inherited image remains the primary tool people use to interpret what they see. On a smaller scale, this creates a very concrete distortion. A person follows the conflict through news feeds and looks for familiar signals: movement on the map, territory gained or lost, moments that feel decisive. When those signals are absent or ambiguous, the war appears stalled, strange, or even unreal. But nothing is wrong with the war itself. What is wrong is the lens. The inherited image trains observers to expect clarity where there is none, and resolution where the system does not require one. It turns war into a spectacle that must periodically prove it is still happening. And when modern conflict fails to meet that expectation, it becomes harder to recognize its actual dynamics. This gap between perception and reality is not a minor misunderstanding. It directly affects how events are interpreted, how pressure is measured, and how outcomes are anticipated. As long as modern war is evaluated through outdated categories, its real mechanisms remain partially invisible, not because they are hidden, but because they no longer resemble what people were taught to look for. That disconnect is the starting point. Until it is acknowledged, everything that follows will continue to look confusing, slow, or meaningless, even when it is neither. For a long time, war was understood through industrial logic. Armies were built like factories. Power was measured in quantities: personnel, vehicles, shells, territory. Victory was assumed to be the result of accumulation: more resources, more production, more pressure applied over time. That logic shaped not only strategy, but expectation. If one side could outproduce the other, the outcome felt predictable. If losses were absorbed and lines kept moving, the system made sense. War appeared as a material contest between states, fought through mass and endurance. Modern war no longer fully operates on that logic, but the myth persists. At a structural level, industrial capacity is no longer the decisive bottleneck it once was. The limiting factor has shifted from production to coordination. From how much can be made, to how effectively information moves through the system. Sensors, communication, targeting, feedback loops, these now shape the battlefield more than sheer volume. This is not an abstract shift. It changes how power is exercised. A smaller force with faster detection, better data fusion, and tighter decision cycles can impose pressure disproportionate to its size. Not by overwhelming the enemy with mass, but by selectively disrupting critical nodes: logistics, command, morale, infrastructure. The conflict becomes less about grinding forward and more about maintaining system integrity under constant interference. On the human level, this transformation is subtle but decisive. Operators do not experience war as a continuous frontline struggle. They interact with fragments: signals, coordinates, alerts, windows of opportunity. Actions are no longer embedded in a visible flow of battle. They are discrete interventions inside a larger network. Because of this, familiar industrial indicators lose explanatory power. Counting vehicles destroyed or territory exchanged no longer reflects the actual balance of pressure. Systems can degrade without dramatic visuals. Control can erode long before collapse becomes visible. This is where the myth becomes dangerous. When war is still interpreted as an industrial contest, observers look for industrial outcomes, decisive offensives, clear breakthroughs, moments of exhaustion. When those fail to appear, the conclusion is often that nothing meaningful is happening. In reality, the conflict may already be reshaping conditions in ways that will only become obvious later. Digital reality does not announce itself. It accumulates effects quietly, unevenly, and across layers that do not align with traditional narratives. The battlefield is no longer a single space where forces collide. It is a distributed system where pressure is applied wherever coherence can be weakened. Industrial war rewarded mass. Digital war rewards connectivity, speed, and asymmetry. Understanding that shift is essential because it explains why modern conflicts feel unfamiliar, prolonged, and difficult to interpret. The rules most people still rely on were designed for a different type of war, one that no longer defines how power is actually exercised. And as long as those myths remain intact, the real structure of modern conflict will continue to be misread, not because it is complex, but because it no longer fits the old industrial frame. Most of modern war does not happen where people are looking. The visible layer, explosions, strikes, movement on the map, is only the surface expression of a much larger process. What actually determines momentum happens elsewhere, in detection, interpretation, prioritization, and delay. The battlefield has expanded into domains that rarely produce dramatic images, but consistently shape outcomes. At a systemic level, war has shifted from confrontation to exposure. The central task is no longer to defeat the enemy directly, but to continuously reveal their structure. Where they move, how they communicate, what they depend on, which elements are rigid, and which are fragile. Information becomes pressure long before it becomes action. This is why visibility itself turns into a weapon. Sensors, signals, electronic traces, patterns of behavior, all of these feed into a persistent process of mapping the opponent as a system. The goal is not a single decisive strike, but sustained asymmetry in awareness. One side sees more, understands faster, and reacts earlier. The other side operates inside growing uncertainty. On the micro level, this produces a strange contradiction. A person involved in the conflict may experience long periods where nothing happens, no advances, no dramatic events. Just waiting, monitoring, adjusting. From the outside, this looks like stagnation. From inside the system, it is constant activity, filtering noise, validating data, updating priorities. Because this activity rarely translates into immediate spectacle, it is often ignored by observers. Media logic reinforces this distortion. Cameras focus on moments of impact, not on the slow accumulation of informational advantage. But by the time impact becomes visible, the decisive processes have usually already occurred. This is why modern war feels opaque. The traditional expectation is that war reveals itself through escalation. That pressure must be loud, visible, and undeniable. In reality, pressure can be continuous and almost silent. Systems weaken not because they are struck repeatedly, but because they are forced to operate under constant observation, disruption, and anticipation. The invisible battlefield also collapses distinctions. There is no clear boundary between reconnaissance and attack, between preparation and execution. Actions blend into each other. What looks like restraint may simply be positioning. What looks like calm may be the result of one side already operating with incomplete information. This changes how outcomes should be interpreted. If war is assessed only by visible damage, most of its logic is missed. The decisive factor becomes not who strikes harder, but who maintains coherence longer under conditions of sustained exposure. And that struggle rarely produces clear milestones. It unfolds gradually, unevenly, and largely outside the frame people are used to watching. The danger is not that this battlefield is hidden. It is that it is mistaken for absence. When observers assume that what cannot be seen is not happening, they misunderstand both the pace and the direction of modern conflict. The war has not disappeared. It has moved into layers where visibility no longer guarantees understanding, and where outcomes are shaped long before they become obvious. Modern war operates at a speed that exceeds human comprehension. The most important shift is not technological complexity, but temporal compression. The time between detection and action has collapsed. What once took hours or days, confirmation, authorization, execution, can now happen in minutes, sometimes seconds. The system does not wait for understanding. It moves as soon as conditions are met. At a structural level, this creates a fundamental imbalance. Decision-making loops are optimized for responsiveness, not reflection. Information flows faster than it can be fully interpreted. By the time a human actor forms a coherent picture, the situation the picture describes may already be outdated. This is not a failure of individuals. It is a property of the system. Modern military structures are built to reduce latency. Sensors feed directly into command networks. Alerts trigger predefined responses. The goal is to act before the opponent is, even if that action is based on partial data. Speed itself becomes a form of dominance. On the micro level, this changes the nature of responsibility. An operator does not experience their action as a deliberate decision in a complete context. They respond to prompts, thresholds, and time windows. The question is no longer, is this fully understood, but, is this fast enough? Hesitation becomes a liability. As a result, errors stop being exceptional. They become structural. When systems operate faster than their human components can reason, mistakes are not signs of negligence. They are inevitable byproducts. Misidentifications, misinterpretations, unintended escalations, these are not anomalies in a high-speed environment. They are expected outcomes of compressed decision cycles. From the outside, this creates a paradox. Observers assume that greater speed implies greater control. That faster systems are more precise, more deliberate, more rational. In practice, speed often reduces the space where judgment can exist at all. Control is replaced by momentum. Once a system begins reacting primarily to itself, to alerts, to feedback, to anticipated responses, it can enter a self-reinforcing loop. Actions generate signals that trigger further actions. The process continues not because someone intends escalation, but because stopping requires more time than the system allows. This is how agency erodes without disappearing. No single person feels responsible for the overall trajectory, because no single person experiences it as a whole. Each action makes sense locally. Each response appears justified in isolation. The loss of control is only visible when looking at the system from the outside, a perspective few participants ever have. Speed, in this context, is not efficiency. It is pressure. It forces decisions to be made under conditions where understanding is always incomplete and consequences are always deferred. Modern war does not spiral because people seek chaos, but because the tempo leaves no room to reassert control once motion has begun. And the faster the system moves, the harder it becomes to distinguish deliberate action from automated continuation, a distinction that used to define what control actually meant. The role of the individual in war has changed, even if the language around it has not. For most of history, the soldier was defined by physical presence. Risk was direct, actions were embodied, and consequences were immediate. The distance between decision and outcome was short enough to be felt. War was experienced through proximity, to danger, to the enemy, to death. Modern war breaks that proximity. At a structural level, human participation is increasingly mediated through interfaces. Screens, sensors, feeds, control panels. The individual no longer confronts the battlefield directly. They interact with representations of it. Symbols replace bodies. Data points replace terrain. Action is routed through layers of abstraction before it manifests as force. This does not make the individual less important. It makes them different. On the micro level, the person involved in combat often experiences war as task execution rather than confrontation. Identify. Track. Confirm. Act. Each step is discrete, bounded, and framed as a technical operation. The system does not ask for moral synthesis. It asks for correct input at the correct time. Because of this, the classical heroic narrative begins to fail. Heroism depended on visibility, on shared risk, on observable sacrifice, on moments that could be clearly framed as courage. When action is distributed across networks and mediated by technology, those moments fragment. Responsibility spreads across many hands, none of which fully grasp the outcome on their own. This creates a psychological gap. The operator may cause real and irreversible effects while experiencing none of the sensory markers traditionally associated with violence. There is no physical struggle, no immediate feedback, no visceral confirmation. The system works precisely because it removes friction, emotional, physical, and temporal. From the outside, this looks like distance. From the inside, it feels like normality. The danger is not desensitization in a simplistic sense. It is misalignment. The scale of impact no longer matches the scale of experience. Decisions with strategic consequences are made in environments that feel procedural and controlled. The mind adapts to the interface, not to the reality behind it. This is why modern war resists heroic framing. Not because individuals lack courage or commitment, but because the structure no longer produces moments that fit the old mold. War is no longer a stage for singular acts. It is a system of continuous operation, where significance emerges from accumulation rather than spectacle. The individual does not disappear. They are absorbed. Recast as an operator within a larger mechanism, responsible for precision, speed, and compliance with process. The language of heroism lingers, but the function has shifted. And with it, the way responsibility, agency, and meaning are experienced by the people inside the system. That shift is not cosmetic. It fundamentally alters how war is lived, even when its consequences remain just as real. At a certain point, speed and complexity force a delegation of judgment. Modern war does not simply use algorithms as tools. It integrates them into decision-making itself. Systems sort data, flag anomalies, rank priorities, and propose actions long before a human engages with the situation. The algorithm does not pull the trigger, but it increasingly defines what the trigger is connected to. At the structural level, this marks a quiet but profound shift. Decisions are no longer formed from a blank state. They arrive pre-shaped. The human actor is presented not with the full space of possibilities, but with a narrowed set of options filtered by automated logic. The question becomes not, what should be done, but do we accept this recommendation? This changes the nature of responsibility. On the micro level, a person rarely experiences the algorithm as an authority. It feels neutral, technical, supportive. It does not command, it suggests. But those suggestions are backed by volumes of data no individual could process alone, and delivered at a speed that discourages resistance. Ignoring them requires justification. Accepting them does not. Over time, this creates asymmetry. The system remembers everything. Patterns, correlations, historical responses. The human operator remembers fragments. Under pressure, deference becomes rational. Trust shifts from personal judgment to statistical confidence. The algorithm does not need to be correct in every case. It only needs to be correct often enough to become default. This is where ethical clarity begins to erode. When outcomes are the result of layered interactions between humans and automated processes, accountability disperses. No single actor feels fully responsible for the result, because no single actor authored the decision in its entirety. Each step was reasonable. Each input was justified. The final outcome emerges from aggregation rather than intent. And unlike humans, algorithms do not carry consequence. They do not experience risk, hesitation, or doubt. They do not bleed. Their logic remains unchanged by the effects it helps produce. When failure occurs, it is framed as a technical issue, a misclassification, a threshold error, a data problem, not as a moral event. From the outside, this can look like dehumanization. From inside the system, it feels like efficiency. The algorithm does not replace the human. It reshapes the human's role. Judgment becomes supervisory rather than generative. Agency shifts from choosing actions to validating processes. Over time, the boundary between decision and execution blurs. This does not make war autonomous. It makes it diffuse. Violence is no longer a moment tied to a person. It is a function that activates when conditions align. The system does not ask why in human terms. It asks whether parameters are satisfied. And once war reaches that point, its character changes fundamentally. Not because machines are evil or humans are absent, but because meaning, responsibility, and consequence are no longer concentrated where action occurs. The system continues to function. No one inside it feels like they chose the outcome. The idea of a clear front line belongs to a different kind of war. For a long time, conflict was structured around geography. There was a front and a rear, a zone of danger and a zone of relative safety. Even when war was intense, it was spatially contained. You could point to where it was happening, and where it was not. Modern war dissolves that distinction. At a systemic level, the front line no longer functions as a boundary. Pressure is applied wherever a system is vulnerable, not where a line happens to be drawn. Infrastructure, information flows, logistics, morale, economic stability, all of these become valid targets regardless of physical distance from combat zones. The battlefield stops being a place. It becomes a condition. On the micro level, this shift is immediately felt by those who were once considered outside the war. Civilians, institutions, private networks, everyday routines, all become exposed to forms of pressure that do not resemble traditional violence, but carry strategic weight. Disruption replaces destruction. Uncertainty replaces direct threat. This is why modern war feels omnipresent without being constantly visible. There may be long stretches without explosions, without movement of troops, without obvious escalation. And yet, systems are under continuous strain. Communication is interfered with. Supply chains are destabilized. Information environments are flooded, distorted, or weaponized. The goal is not to defeat an army in one place, but to degrade coherence everywhere. As a result, the psychological dimension expands. When there is no clear front line, there is no clear moment of engagement or relief. The sense of being, behind the lines, disappears. Stress does not come from immediate danger alone, but from sustained unpredictability. The conflict intrudes into daily life not as an event, but as background noise that never fully fades. This has strategic consequences. Societies accustomed to spatial separation between war and normality struggle to adapt. Traditional resilience mechanisms rely on the assumption that war has a location and a duration. When those assumptions collapse, fatigue accumulates in diffuse ways. Pressure is absorbed unevenly, often without a clear signal that it is happening. From the outside, this can look like overreaction or paranoia. From inside the system, it feels like erosion. The collapse of the front line also reframes participation. There is no longer a clean division between combatants and non-combatants in functional terms. People may not be fighting, but they are being acted upon. Their behavior, expectations, and trust become variables in the conflict. This does not mean that everyone is a soldier. It means that the environment itself has become contested. War no longer advances only by moving forward. It advances by spreading sideways, seeping into structures that were never designed to operate under constant pressure. And because there is no visible line to cross, it becomes harder to recognize when the war has already arrived. By the time the distinction is acknowledged, the front line has long since ceased to exist. Modern war does not begin the way people expect it to. There is rarely a single moment that clearly separates peace from conflict. No formal declaration, no unmistakable threshold. Pressure accumulates gradually, through actions that are individually deniable, reversible, or framed as something else entirely. By the time war is widely acknowledged, it has often been underway for a long time. At a systemic level, this reflects a shift in purpose. The objective is no longer to cross a line, but to avoid creating one. Continuous pressure is more effective than open escalation, because it forces adaptation without triggering full mobilization. The system is stressed, but never allowed to reset. War becomes a process rather than an event. This process operates across timescales that do not fit traditional narratives. There are no clear phases of buildup, clash, and resolution. Instead, there are fluctuations in intensity. Periods of relative calm are not peace, but modulation. Activity does not stop, it changes form. On the micro level, this fundamentally alters perception. Individuals experience the conflict as a persistent background condition. Not dramatic enough to demand constant attention, but never absent enough to be ignored. News cycles move on. Daily routines continue. And yet, the pressure remains embedded in infrastructure, information, and expectations. This is where normalization sets in. When war does not disrupt life all at once, it slowly integrates into it. Behaviors adjust. Risk thresholds shift. What would once have been perceived as unacceptable becomes manageable, then routine. The absence of a clear start makes resistance harder to organize, because there is no moment that feels urgent enough to demand total response. From the outside, this looks like passivity. From the inside, it feels like endurance. The strategic advantage of continuity is exhaustion without collapse. Systems are kept functional, but strained. Resources are consumed not in decisive moments, but through sustained friction. Attention erodes. Cohesion weakens. The conflict does not seek resolution, it seeks persistence. This also reframes how outcomes should be understood. Victory is no longer defined by a final act or a visible endpoint. It emerges gradually, through accumulated advantages that are difficult to trace back to a single cause. Defeat, likewise, rarely arrives as a sudden loss. It manifests as an inability to recover, adapt, or restore coherence. In this form of war, peace is not the default state. It is a temporary condition achieved through effort. The danger lies in misrecognition. When war is expected to announce itself loudly and end decisively, a continuous process is mistaken for stability. By the time the nature of the conflict becomes undeniable, its effects are already deeply embedded. Modern war does not wait to be named. It does not pause for clarity. It operates by becoming part of the environment, shaping behavior, choices, and limits long before anyone agrees on what to call it. The most dangerous gap in modern war is not technological. It is perceptual. While the structure of conflict has changed, the image used to understand it has not. Public imagination still relies on visual cues, clear phases, and decisive moments. It expects war to look a certain way in order to recognize it as such. When those expectations are not met, the conflict feels incomplete, confusing, or somehow unreal. But modern war does not need to conform to an image to function. At a systemic level, this mismatch creates strategic blindness. Decisions are evaluated through outdated categories. Pressure is underestimated because it is not dramatic. Escalation is misread because it does not follow familiar patterns. The absence of spectacle is mistaken for the absence of intent. This is not ignorance. It is lag. Every major transformation in warfare has produced a period where reality moved faster than understanding. New forms emerged before the language to describe them existed. During that gap, misinterpretation was common, and mistakes were often made not because information was lacking, but because perception was misaligned. The same pattern is unfolding again. On the micro level, this gap shapes how individuals relate to the conflict around them. People look for signs that confirm or deny the presence of war, relying on inherited markers that no longer apply. When those signs fail to appear, engagement weakens. Urgency fades. The situation is categorized as temporary, manageable, or not fully real. Meanwhile, the system continues to operate. Modern war does not require consensus to advance. It does not wait for recognition or clarity. It progresses through processes that are effective precisely because they do not demand immediate emotional response. By the time the effects become undeniable, they are often framed as outcomes rather than ongoing actions. This is why the image matters. Without a new mental model, societies respond too late or in the wrong ways. They prepare for battles that never arrive and overlook pressures that are already shaping behavior, infrastructure, and limits. The conflict is treated as something external, episodic, and controllable, when it is none of those things. The image that could make modern war legible has not fully formed yet. Until it does, understanding will remain fragmented. Events will feel disconnected. Causes will be debated long after effects are already in motion. The war will appear to drift, even as it follows a coherent internal logic. Modern war does not announce itself through spectacle. It reveals itself through accumulation. And the greatest risk is not that it is too complex to understand, but that it is still being looked at through an image that no longer exists.